I want to start with a morning I don't talk about very often. It was a school day. I had lesson plans. I had IEPs to review. I had student who needed a specific accommodation set up before the bell rang, and I had not done it yet. I knew all of these, and still I could not make myself get off the bathroom floor. I wasn't sick. Nothing dramatic had happened. I was just done. Like someone had unplugged me overnight and the battery never charged back. I sat there for probably 20 minutes telling myself to get up, and my body just said no. So I eventually got up, I went in, I did the thing, I taught the lessons, I checked in with my students. From the outside, it looked like perfectly functional teaching day, but I knew something that morning that I had been avoiding knowing for a long time. I was burned out, not tired, not stressed, but burned out. The kind that does not respond to a 3-day weekend, that kind that lives in your nervous system and changes how you see your classroom, your kids, your career, yourself. Welcome to the Bilingual SPED podcast. I am Maria Angala, National Board Certified Bilingual Special Education Teacher Leader, developer of the A.C.C.E.S.S Access Literacy Framework, and today we're going to talk about something that nobody's professional development prepared me for: how to actually recover from a burnout and build a teaching life that doesn't eat you alive. This episode is called Burnout-to-Balance Blueprint, and I want to be clear about something from the very beginning. It's not a self care episode. I'm not going to tell you to take a bubble bath or to buy a planner or wake up 30 minutes earlier to journal. If that's what you came for, I love you, but this is not that. This is a systems episode. This is a boundaries episode. This is a let's get honest about why you are running on empty and then actually rebuild something that works episode. There is a difference between recovering from burnout and just resting until you are functioning enough to be consumed again. And we are here to do the first one. So let me describe burnout the way it actually shows up in a bilingual special education teacher's life, because the general description doesn't always capture our specific flavor of it. It's the Sunday night dread that starts Saturday afternoon. It's opening your email after a weekend and immediately feeling your chest tighten. It's sitting in an IEP meeting. You have run 8,000 times and suddenly having no patience for the process. Not because you don't care about the student, but because you are so depleted that caring feels like a physical exertion you cannot afford. It is the moment you realize you have been running accommodations on autopilot. You are modifying the assignment, but you have stopped thinking about whether the modification is actually working. You're going through the motions of differentiation without the genuine inquiry behind it. And you know this, which makes it worse. It is the resentment, and this is the one nobody wants to name out loud. The low grade resentment of doing the work that 2 or 3 specialists should be sharing with none of the support, the compensation, or the recognition. And then feeling guilty about the resentment because you chose this, because you love the kids, because teachers don't supposed to feel resentful. The World Health Organization classifies burnout as an occupational phenomenon, not a personal failure. The 3 defining features are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, which is that distancing or cynicism I just described, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. And a 2024 RAND Corporation study found that 59% of teachers report experiencing burnout symptoms frequently. Frequently, not occasionally, not after a hard week. Frequently. You are not weak for being in that number. You are in a system that was designed without adequate support for the complexity of what you do. That is not an excuse to stay stuck. It's a context for understanding why getting out requires more than shift. It requires a structural shift. So here's what I have noticed about self-care narrative in education. It puts the solution inside a person while leaving the system unnoticed and untouched. And for teachers, especially bilingual special education teachers who are managing IEP compliance, language acquisition support, behavioral intervention, family communication across language barriers, and often coverage for positions that haven't been filled, individual self care practices aren't enough to counter a systematically draining environment. I tried the self care routine. I meditated. I made a vision board. I took personal days and came back to the pile of sub unfriendly lesson plans and 17 unanswered emails. And I would spend those personal days anxious about what was accumulating in my absence. The rest wasn't restful because the system hadn't changed. I came back to the same conditions. What actually worked and what we're going to talk about today was rebuilding my instructional system so that the daily workload stopped requiring everything I had to sustain it, systematizing the parts of my practice that have been running on willpower and over time, setting real professional limits that I could actually hold, and recovering my identity as a full human being whose value isn't exclusively measured by how much she gives to her job. That is the blueprint. It's also not complicated, but it's also not easy because it requires us to stop being martyrs long enough to become sustainable. So let's build it together. One of the things that genuinely made me feel less crazy when I was in my most burned out was finding out just how much bilingual special education teachers actually do. Documented, measured, compared to what the system officially accounts for. So, a 2022 study published in the Journal of Special Education Leadership found that special education teachers spend an average of 8.8 hours per week on paperwork alone. IEP documentation, progress reports, compliance documentations beyond their contracted instructional hours, and that is more than a full additional workday every week on administrative tasks that are legally required but not factor into the instructional design of the job. And for bilingual special education teachers, that number often climbs higher. We're also managing translation of documents, communication with families in two or more languages, navigation of the intersection between language acquisition processes and learning disability identification, which is its own specialized practice that most IEP teams don't have deep expertise in. We are often the most knowledgeable person in that room on that question, and we're frequently doing that expert work without the title, the compensation, or the reduced caseload that would logically accompany it. I remember tracking my time for 1 week just to see. I tracked everything: instructional time, planning, IEP writing, family communication, assessment, intervention, documentation, informal consultation with colleagues, materials creation. That week, I worked 61 hours. My contracted hours were 40 hours. The gap between those two numbers, that was my personal life. That was my health. That was my sleep. And I had been doing that for years before I finally named it as unsustainable. The problem isn't that you are inefficient. The problem is that the volume of specialized work required by your role was never accurately calculated when the job was designed. And because teachers, especially teachers who love their students, have been filling that gap with their own time and their own energy, the gap has never had to be addressed. When we burn out and leave, the gap remains, and another teacher arrives and tries to fill it in with their own reserves, and the cycle continues. We break it by refusing to fund it with our well being. So, I want to name something that doesn't show up in workload studies because it is nearly impossible to measure: the emotional labor of bilingual special education teaching. I don't mean the love you have for your students, though that is real and it is weight bearing in its own way. I mean the active, skilled, continuous work of managing your own emotional responses while simultaneously managing the emotional needs of a room full of students, children who have trauma histories, who have sensory processing differences, language barriers, and IEP goals that sometimes feel impossibly ambitious given what they are carrying. I mean, sitting across from a parent in an IEP meeting who is exhausted, terrified about their child's future, and sometimes angry because fear often comes out as anger, and holding steady, translating not just the language but the meaning, being the person who says, "Your child is valued here," in two languages, while also reading the fine print of present levels of performance and placement decisions. I mean, de escalating a meltdown at 9 o'clock in the morning and then immediately pivoting to a whole group reading lesson because you have 20 minutes of instruction time left before specials. And doing that translation so seamlessly that the other students barely notice because your skilled presence is what keeps the room regulated. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild coined the term emotional labor in 1983, describing the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display. Teachers do this every single day at a clinical level. And unlike a flight attendant, Hochschild's original example, teachers are doing emotional labor for children whose development and sometimes safety depends on it. The stakes are not the same. The toll is not the same. What I want you to hear is this: if you feel emotionally drained after work in a way that doesn't seem proportional to how physically active your day was, you are not being dramatic. You are accurately reading what your job is actually doing to you. And that cost deserves to be accounted for in how you recover and how you build systems going forward. I want to spend a few minutes on what the research says about what chronic burnout actually does to your cognitive functioning because I think when we understand the mechanism, it becomes easier to take our own recovery seriously. Studies on occupational burnout and cognitive performance, including research published in Work and Stress and the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology, consistently show that chronic burnout impairs working memory, executive function, cognitive flexibility. Those are the exact cognitive skills you need to run a bilingual special education classroom. Working memory is how you hold the student's current IEP goal in your head while simultaneously tracking their performance, adjusting your language, and noticing what the rest of the class is doing. Executive function is how you pivot between instructional modes, manage unexpected behavioral escalations, and maintain lesson pacing. Cognitive flexibility is how you differentiate in real time, how you read students' pace, recognize that the planned approach isn't working, and adapt on the spot. Burnout literally reduces your capacity to do the most sophisticated parts of your job. And because those are also the parts that most require your presence and your expertise, you start to feel like you're falling short, but you're not. Okay, this feeds the burnout, which further impairs the cognition, which produces more feelings of inadequacy. That is a cycle, not a character flaw. and you can interrupt it, but only if you take the disruption seriously enough to make real changes, not just symptomatic ones. And the good news, and I mean is genuinely mean it, is that our brain is remarkably responsive to recovery when the conditions are actually different. Neuroplasticity doesn't stop in adulthood. When the source of the stress is reduced and replaced with different inputs, the brain repairs. You don't have to stay here, but you do have to actually change something. When I started really thinking about what sustainable teaching looks like, not just survival, but genuine balance, I kept returning to these 5 domains, 5 areas that, when they are in chronic deficit, they create burnout. And when they are tended to, they create conditions for longevity in this work. I'm going to name them quickly here, and then we will build strategies for each one throughout the rest of the episode. Number 1, time. How you protect, allocate, and set limits on your professional hours, including the invisible hours. Number 2, emotion. How you process what the job puts in your body and how you discharge before it becomes chronic. Number 3, instruction. How your systems reduce unnecessary cognitive load so that your expertise goes into impact, not maintenance. Number 4, identity. How you protect and invest in who you are outside of the role of teacher. And number 5 is wellness. How you treat your body and nervous system as professional resources that require maintenance. These 5 domains are the framework for everything we're building today. And notice that the only one of them, domain number 3, is about your instruction. And that is deliberate, because burnout recovery cannot be an instructional fix alone. If you try to solve the whole person problem with a classroom management strategy, you will run out of runway. So the Access framework maps into all 5 of these domains, which is part of why I keep coming back to it as a recovery tool and not just a lesson planning tool. But we will get there. So right now, let's look at each domain honestly. So let's start with time, because it is the domain where most teachers feel the most visible scarcity and have the most unexamined assumptions. And I'm going to ask you to do something that I resisted for years because I was afraid of what I would find. A time audit. Not a big production, just a week of honest tracking. So ask yourself a question. Where does your professional time actually go? When I did mine, I found a few things I wasn't expecting. First, I was spending an enormous amount of time on tasks that were urgent but not high impact. Email responses that could have been, waiting. Documentation that I was redoing because my templates weren't efficient. Meetings that didn't require my full attention but got it anyway because I didn't have a protocol for what level of presence each type of meeting actually needed. Second, I was spending time on tasks that were genuinely mine to do, but in an inefficient order, meaning I was starting complex IEP sections cold without a thinking scaffold, and then spending 30 minutes on something that could have taken 10 minutes with a better template. Third, and this is the one that surprised me most, I was spending significant time managing the anxiety about tasks I hadn't even started yet. Worrying about the IEP draft, dreading the parent communication, mentally rehearsing the difficult conversation. That anxious anticipation doesn't show up as a task, but it consumes real cognitive and emotional resources, and it often persists well into the evening hours, which is supposed to be recovery time. So, the time audit isn't about shame. It isn't about shame. It is about information. You cannot protect time you have not looked at. And once you see where it goes, you have choices you didn't know you had. Okay? So, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough airtime in educator wellness conversations. What happens to your nervous system when it's chronically activated, and how that affects your capacity to regulate not just your students, but yourself. Co regulation is a foundational concept in special education. The idea that a regulated adult nervous system is what creates the external scaffolding that allows a dysregulated child to find a way back to a window of tolerance. We teach this, we practice it, we know it works. But here's what I've had to acknowledge: I cannot co regulate students from a chronically dysregulated state. And chronic burnout is a state of nervous system dysregulation, elevated cortisol, reduced capacity for cognitive flexibility, shortened patience window, faster irritability threshold. These aren't moral failures, they are physiological realities of chronic stress. And I've had moments in my classroom, and I'm being honest here, where a student's behavior escalated, and instead of feeling grounded and responsive, I felt the edge of my own activation. That cold flash where you know you're not in your best self. And in special education, in bilingual context where a child may not have the language to explain what's happening, those are the moments that demand the most of us. So the research on this is important. A 2021 study in the Journal of School Psychology found that teachers' emotional regulation capacity directly predicted student behavioral outcomes more so than classroom management strategies. Who you are in the room matters more than what you do in the room. And who you are in the room is determined in part by whether your nervous system has had adequate recovery time between activations. And this is why the evening decompression routine, the transition between school and home, isn't a luxury. It is clinical necessity. Your nervous system needs a signal that work is over, not just a change in location. We'll get to specific strategies in the strategy section, but I want you to understand the mechanism first, okay? Because when you understand why something works, you're more likely actually to do it. So I want to name something that I think is at the root of the deepest burnout, the kind that makes teachers consider leaving the job entirely: identity erosion. And it happens slowly. You stop doing the hobbies because there is no time. You cancel plans because you are too tired. Your conversations outside of work start revolving around work because that's the only world that's running at full speed. And one day, you realize that when someone asks you who you are, your answer is entirely about your job: teacher, special education, bilingual. I went through this. There was a stretch of years where if you asked me what I did for fun, I would have to think about it and then felt embarrassed by how long it took. I had become so thoroughly occupied by teaching that I had quietly stopped being the rest of myself. And here is why this matters for sustainability. When teaching is your entire identity, every challenge at work becomes an existential threat. A difficult IEP meeting isn't just a hard day, it's a challenge to who you are. A student who isn't making progress isn't just a professional concern, it is a personal failure. The stakes of every decision become unbearably high because the job and the self have merged. That is dangerous. Protecting your identity outside the classroom is not selfish. It is the structural support that allows you to return to the classroom without bringing the full weight of your self-worth into every instructional decision. The creativity you develop in a hobby sharpens your problem solving in the classroom. The relationships you build outside school give you something to protect, which means you protect them, which means you go home at a reasonable time. The movement practice grounds you in your body, which is what regulates your nervous system, which is what allows you to co-regulate your students. You are a whole person that is not in conflict with being an excellent teacher. It is what makes an excellent teaching sustainable. Okay, so let's talk strategy now. And I want to start with the one area where I have the most specific, tested classroom-proven advice. Using the Access Literacy Framework, not just a student learning system, but as a teacher workload reduction system. So this reframe changed how I approach my entire practice. The 6 phases of the framework: activate, clarify, chunk, engage, support, and synthesize, aren't just a lesson structure. They are thinking scaffold that, once internalized, dramatically reduces the amount of energy you spend on instructional planning because the structure is consistent even when the content changes. So A for activate: build once, reuse deliberately. When you have a reliable activate protocol, a consistent way to access prior knowledge and set the purpose for learning, you stop planning the opening from scratch every time. The structure is the same. The content slots in. Let's minutes back every single planning period. And then C for clarify: template your vocabulary work. Pre-teach vocabulary with a consistent visual format means your material creation times drop significantly. One template serves every unit. Students learn the format and stop needing directions, which means less instructional time lost to logistics. C for chunk: your differentiation becomes a system, not a daily scramble. When you're chunking, it is building into your planning protocol, not added on at the end. You differentiate during the design phase, not after. This means you stop staying late to create 3 different versions of every worksheet. You start with a framework that produces them. E for engage: predictable structure lets students lead. When students know the collaborative structures, think parent share, jigsaws, structured academic controversy, you spend less time managing the engagement and more time observing it. Familiar structures require less teacher narration. Students self-manage more. Your energy is freed for the students who need you most. S for support: your IEP accommodations live in the system, not in your head. So when accommodations are embedded in your lesson structure, not tacked on as in afterthought, you stop holding them in working memory. They're just part of how instruction works. Fewer cognitive resources spent on compliance, more time spent on teaching. S for synthesize: reflection becomes data without extra work. When synthesis is a consistent close to every lesson, students self-assess in ways that produce usable data. You stop guessing where they are. That knowing reduces the amount of reteaching you plan for and the anxiety about whether they got it. The Access framework is not just good for your students, it is protective infrastructure for you as well. When your planning has a reliable architecture, you stop spending energy reinventing the shape of instruction and start spending it on substance. That shift is not small. Over the course of the school year, it adds up to hundreds of hours. Let me get practical about time. I'm going to share the specific strategies that genuinely move the needle for me. And I'm going to be honest about the ones I tried that sounded good but didn't stick. The 2-window email rule. I check email twice. Once in the morning before the students arrive and once in the afternoon during a planning window, during contracted hours. And that is it. Email does not live open on my screen while I am teaching or planning. This sounds simple, and it is. But implementing it required me to communicate clearly to families and colleagues about my response window and to accept not everything is an emergency even when it feels like one. It took about 3 weeks to feel normal, but it has never gone back. The IEP template stack. I built templates for every recurring IEP section, present levels in each domain, SMART goal frameworks, accommodation, rationale, language. I spent about 4 hours building them once and have saved hundreds of hours since. The writing is still mine, the thinking is still mine, but I am not starting from a blank page, which means I am not fighting the blank page paralysis that can turn a 40-minute IEP writing session into 2 hours. The hard stop. I have a time that I leave school, not a time I plan to leave. A time I leave. It is non-negotiable on days when I don't have a scheduled meeting. When I hit the time, I close my laptop, I pack my bag, and go. Work didn't get done until tomorrow during contracted hours. This was the hardest habit to build because it required me to trust that tomorrow me was capable and to let go of that belief that staying late made me a better teacher. It doesn't. It makes me a more exhausted teacher. The done list. Every Friday before I leave, I write a done list, not a to-do list. Everything I completed, communicated, managed, created, navigated during the week. This is not journaling. It takes about 7 minutes, but it serves a crucial psychological function. It gives me documented evidence of my actual productivity, which counteracts the end of week feeling of, I didn't get anything done. Burnout. Burnout distorts your perception of your own effectiveness. The done list is a reality check. So I want to talk about emotional boundaries because I think this is a version of this conversation that sounds like careless. And that is not what I am saying. You are in this work because you care. Caring is the engine. The question is whether caring is sustainable or whether you are running it in a way that will eventually burn out the engine. The distinction I have found most useful is the difference between empathy and absorption. Empathy is your capacity to understand and feel alongside another person. Absorption is when that feeling stays in your body after the interaction is over and becomes yours to carry indefinitely. Empathy is a professional strength. Absorption is a professional hazard. Here's what absorption looked like in my life. And I remember this. I would lie awake thinking about a student's home situation. I would replay a difficult parent conversation at dinner. I would feel guilty on weekends because I was resting while my students were navigating whatever they were navigating during that weekend. The caring never fully turned off because there was no structural signal that it was allowed to. Building emotional limits does not mean you stop caring. It means you create a container for the caring so that it does not leak into every hour of your life. Practically, this looks like a decompression ritual between work and home. Mine is a 60-minute drive where I don't make phone calls but listen to my podcasts. I just let the day exist and then recede. Looks like not checking school email on weekends except in genuine emergencies. It looks like having one sentence you say to yourself at the end of each workday. I did what I could do today. Tomorrow, I will do what I can do tomorrow. That sounds almost too simple, but neuroscience tells us that narrative self-talk during transitions genuinely help the brain shift out of a task-engaged state. It also looks like dancing. Doing my dance practice at the end of school day before I come home. It looks like separating the student's story from your story. Their circumstances are real and they matter, and you are not the only variable in their outcome. You are an important variable, but a child's trajectory is not determined by whether their teacher answered on an email at 10 o'clock in the evening on a Sunday. It is determined by sustained high quality, emotionally attuned instruction over time that you can give, but only if you are still standing. So, I want to talk about two things that changed my recovery more than anything else: productivity related, movement, and creativity. Movement first. Dance. I am not a fitness person, but I want to be very clear about that. I don't love the gym. I didn't grow up athletic. But I discovered through the research on cortisol regulation and through my own experience that my mood and my capacity for patience were measurably different on days when I moved my body than on days when I didn't. The research supports this consistently. Dance, aerobic exercise reduces cortisol. increases dopamine and serotonin, and improves the executive function capacity that burnout erodes. For me, what worked was not a program, it was dance. My dance practice after work. It was a walk, like a 20-minute walk at the beach before I come home. 20 minutes, no phone calls, 60 minutes or 2 hours of dance, just movement, and whatever or whoever was around me during that time. I started doing it in the morning before school, walking, and then after school, dance practice, and it shifted how I arrived in my classroom in a way that felt almost unfair to compare to how I arrived when I had driven straight from bed to building. I'm not telling you what your movement practice should be. Walks, dance, yoga, swimming, whatever works for you, whatever form your body enjoys. I am telling you that something in that category is not optional if you are in recovery from burnout. Your nervous system needs physical discharge. Sitting with stress and then going to sleep doesn't discharge it. Moving does. Creativity is another one. I make my own dance dresses. And I also paint miniatures, little minis, um, before I play Warhammer. That I used to play Warhammer 40K. So another one is that I started writing again. I write scripts for this podcast. I started writing again. So not as a content, not curriculum, but personal writing. I'm sharing my personal stories with you. These are some creative nonfiction, and what I noticed was that the part of my brain that woke up for that writing, that dance, that painting was the same part that had gotten sluggish in my classroom. The generative, curious, connecting ideas part. Creativity feeds creativity. The investment I made in my own creative practice showed up in my instructional design. My lessons got more interesting because I was more interesting. Because I was nourishing the part of me that makes interesting things. So, what is your creative domain? Writing, music, cooking, visual art, gardening. It does not have to be impressive. It just has to be yours. Something that produces something without it being tied to professional output or student outcomes. Something you make because it matters to you. That thing, make time for it. Not when everything else is done, but because everything else is never going to be done. Schedule it like you schedule an IEP meeting. Put it in your calendar. Show up for yourself the way you show up for your students. I want to be honest with you in the way I try to be honest in every episode. I don't have this fully figured out. I have progress. I have hard-won practices that work most of the time. I have an ongoing relationship with balance that requires maintenance, not a one-time fix. And I have questions I'm still sitting with. One of them is this: how do you hold systemic advocacy and personal sustainability at the same time? Because I believe deeply that the conditions that produce burnout in teachers are systemic problems. Funding, caseloads, compensation, the structural undervaluing of bilingual special education as a specialty, and that individual coping strategies, no matter how good, don't fix those problems. And yet, I also know that waiting for systemic change before recovering personally is a strategy that will leave you depleted while you wait. I have landed on this. Take care of yourself so that you can still be in that room when the systemic change becomes possible. Your presence in this profession, healthy, grounded, expert, and advocating, is itself a form of systemic action. When you stay and when you are sustainable, you model what it looks like. You mentor the newer teachers. You make the case in your building that bilingual special education teachers don't have to burn out and leave because you did not. Another question I sit with is this: how do I know when I have recovered enough to be in full give mode again? Because one of the risks of recovery is that we feel slightly better and then immediately flood back into all the behaviors that produced burnout in the first place. The answer I have found, imperfect but useful, is to let your routines be the measure, not your feelings. When the hard stop is consistent, not effortful. when the decompression ritual happens without debate, when the creative practice feels like looking forward to something, not checking a box, when those things are stable, give mode is sustainably available again. So I want to hear from you. Where are you on this? Are you in the thick of burnout right now and just trying to find a floor? Are you in early recovery and figuring out what structure to build? Are you genuinely well and wanting to stay that way? Come find me at bilingualsped.com. That distinction matters to me because the right support looks different at each stage. I want to bring in some voices here because one of the things I have learned from doing professional development in domestic settings, in international settings, in classrooms and conference rooms and online spaces is that teachers' turning points toward balance are incredibly varied. There's no one story. A teacher I worked with in a PD session told me her turning point was the moment she heard herself snap at a student she adored and then watched herself do it from the outside like she was watching a different person in her body. She said, "That wasn't me." And I decided right then that I was going to find my way back to being me. She took a medical leave. She came back. She's still teaching and she's well. Another teacher told me her turning point was her daughter asking her why she was always sad when she came home from work. Always sad. Said by a 7-year-old with a kind of unfiltered accuracy that children have. She didn't have an answer that felt okay, so she changed the answer by changing the conditions. A bilingual SPED teacher I mentored told me her turning point was finding the Access literacy framework and realizing for the first time that the complexity she'd been managing alone had a structure. And that structure wasn't just useful for her students, it was useful for her too. Gave her a language for what she was doing that she could take into IEP meetings, into administrative conversations, into conversations about caseload. It gave her professional footing when she's been feeling like she was just improvising. What all of these turning points have in common is this: something made the unsustainable visible. Sometimes it's a crisis, sometimes it is a question from a child, sometimes it is stumbling into a resource that names what you have been living. So, whatever have brought you to this episode today, that is your visible moment. The question is, what do you do with it? Let me bring this all together because we have covered a lot of ground and the problem, the mechanism, the 5 domains, the strategies, and I want to hand you something you can actually hold. The Burnout-to-Balance Blueprint is not a single action. It is a set of interlocking commitments that build on each other. And here's the structure. Number 1, name it honestly. You cannot recover from something you are euphemizing. If you are burned out, not tired, not stressed, but burned out in the clinical sense, say that to yourself, to someone you trust. Naming it is not a weakness. It is the beginning of accurate diagnosis. Number 2, audit your time before you change anything else. 1 week, honest tracking. Where does time go? What can be systematized? What can be limited? What can be eliminated? The audit gives you a map. You need a map before you can plan the route. Number 3, build 1 system before you build 5. Choose the highest drain area of your practice and build 1 efficiency, a template, a protocol, a hard stop, a communication boundary. Let it stabilize for 3 weeks before you add another. Sustainable change is slow change. Number 4, create a decompression transition every day before school and the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be long. It has to be consistent. It signals to your nervous system that work is over. Number 5, identify and protect 1 teaching identity, 1 hobby, 1 relationship outside the profession, 1 creative or physical practice that is yours. Schedule it. Treat it like a commitment to your most important student because in terms of your longevity in this work, it is. And number 6, Use the A.C.C.E.S.S framework as infrastructure, not extra work. If you don't have a systematized instructional framework yet, this is the one season and the one reason to build one. It is the single highest leverage instructional change you can make for your workload and your student outcomes simultaneously. And here is the A.C.C.E.S.S framework applied directly to your recovery. A. Activate. Activate a new relationship with your time. Audit it, protect it, treat it as the professional resource that it is. C. Clarify. What is actually holding your job and what is mission creep? Stop doing things out of guilt. Start doing things out of intention. You don't rebuild a sustainable teaching life in a weekend. You do it in small, consistent moves over time. E. Engage your life outside the classroom. Hobbies, the people, the creativity, the rest, that is not indulgence. That is maintenance. If your car needs maintenance, you do too. More importantly, S. Support yourself with the same clinical precision you use to support your students. Individualize your own recovery plan. S. Synthesize. Synthesize a teacher and a human being. You are not just an educator, you are a whole person who chose education. Honor both. Balance is not a destination. It is a dynamic equilibrium that you maintain through ongoing attention, adjustment, and the willingness to maim when something isn't working. Some weeks will be more balanced than others. Some stretches of the school year are inherently more intense. The goal is not perfection. The goal is a baseline that keeps you well enough to do the work you love, long enough to make the difference you came here to make. So, I want to close with something I have learned the hard way. There is no version of recovery that starts perfectly. There's only the version that starts. I spent a long time waiting for the right conditions at the end of the school year, after IEP season, when the new curriculum unit was finished, when my caseload lightened, when things calmed down. And here is the truth about teaching. Things don't calm down. The calendar is always full, and there's always something legitimately important competing for your time and energy. Recovery does not wait for a better moment. Recovery is the decision to make this moment better. So here is what I'm asking you to do. Not after this episode, today, tonight, this week, something small, something real, something that says, I am in this for the long term, and I am going to start building something that lasts. Number one, do the time audit this week. 1 week, honest tracking. Write down where your hours go. You don't have to change anything yet, just see it. Number two, identify your highest drain task and look up one resource on bilingualsped.com or my TPT store, Maria Angala, NBCT, that could systematize it. IEP writing, there's a resource. Differentiated materials, there's a resource. Start there. Number three, name your non-teaching identity. What is the one thing that you used to love doing before teaching consumed calendar? Write it down. Tell someone, block 30 minutes this week and do it, even badly, even briefly. Number four, create a decompression ritual for tomorrow, even if it's just 10 minutes of music in the car before you go inside your home. Give your nervous system a transition signal. Do it tomorrow. Number five, share this episode with one teacher in your building or your network who you know is running on empty. You don't have to say anything, just share it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for a colleague is hand them the thing that said what they couldn't say. So I got off the bathroom floor, not because the system got better overnight. It didn't. Not because the IEPs went away or the caseload shrank or someone finally gave me the support I had been asking for. I got off the floor because I decided to build something different inside the constraints I was in. And slowly, imperfectly, non-linearly, with setbacks I didn't see coming. I did. You can do the same. You are already doing the hardest parts. The complexity of your work, the precision it demands, the love it requires. You have been doing those things on a half-empty tank for longer than you probably realize. Imagine what's possible when the tank is full. Thank you for being here today. Maraming salamat po. Thank you for doing the work you do for the students who need you most in the languages they speak with the individualized care that no algorithm will ever replicate. You are exactly who this profession needs, and this profession needs you to stay. I am Maria Angala. This has been the Bilingual SPED podcast. Take care of yourself out there. I'll see you in the next one. Maraming salamat po.